Okay, something I want to look at today is the very common claim by the abortion lobby that, a few dead women here and there from quacks like Kermit Gosnell is a small price to pay for preventing the scads and scads of deaths we'd have if abortion was illegal. Because they say, before legalization, abortion deaths were horribly high, and it was legalization that made the difference between lots of women dying and just the occasional woman dying. And none of that claim is reality based. And on the surface, the idea that legalization prevents women's deaths might seem like it makes a little bit of sense. Well, if it's legal, then doctors will not be afraid to do it. And only the only the rank amateurs will get arrested. Only the amateurs will be closed down. And I can address that later, but what I want to do right now is just look at the numbers and look at what the numbers tell us. Okay, now the abortion lobby takes two approaches to trying to scare people into thinking that, as much as you find abortion a repellent and repulsive idea, you don't want to be supporting it, you want it to go away, but hey, we have to have it legal so women won't die. You get fed one of two lies. One is the big, bogus, just flat out lie, which is the claim that 5 to 10,000 women a year were dying from illegal abortions before legalization. And the other is kind of a data massage. And I'm going to look at each of those separately. First, let's start with that 5 to 10,000 number. Okay. And on those rare occasions when an abortion rights source cites where they got information from, if they quote this 5 to 10,000, they'll be really careful to quote the most recent person who used it. They don't go back to the original source because the original source was from 1936. Okay. The original source went back to before blood transfusions and antibiotics, which means that even if that number was accurate in 1936, it's absurd to think that it would still be accurate in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But it's even worse than that in terms of how bogus that number is. The book that number comes from is Abortion, Spontaneous and Induced by Dr. Frederick Taussig. Taussig was a big proponent of legalizing abortion. And he got an urban abortion rate from a birth control clinic in New York City and a rural abortion rate, he guessed, from a couple of doctors in Iowa. And he just kind of guessed at a mortality rate and then just multiplied it times the number of abortions that he guessed was happening. And he came up with this 5 to 10,000. Now, 6 years later, in 1942, Taussig went to a conference and he apologized for using the wildest estimates to generate that number. So Taussig himself, the original source of that 5 to 10,000 deaths claim, repudiated his own claim 6 years later. Okay. But during the late 60s and early 70s, when these abortion rights groups were pushing for legalization, they would trot out that 5 to 10,000 number knowing it was bogus, but it was a really nice, scary number. It was useful. They could get people to believe it. So they used it. Now, Bernard Nathanson, one of the people who put forward that lie, he was one of the co-founders of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League. He eventually converted to pro-life and wrote a book called Aborting America, published in 1979, and he totally came clean about it. So, 1979, Nathanson came clean. The abortion lobbies had plenty of time to stop using that BS number. Okay, so anybody who's using that 5 to 10,000 deaths, either they are grossly misinformed or they are flat out lying. It's got to be one of those because that number is known to be bull since 1942. Okay, so whoever it is that's passing that along, you know that they are not an accurate source of information, whether it's because they're lying or because they're believing bogus sources. Now, the other thing that they do is that data massage. And what they'll do, they'll take the trends that were happening, but they will cite the numbers in a way that credits legalization with the drop in abortion deaths, even though it had nothing to do with it, as you can see when you look at the numbers. And I'm just going to give you an example. The Alan Guttmacher Institute quote, as the availability of legally induced abortion increased, mortality due to abortion dropped sharply. The number of abortion-related deaths per million live births fell from nearly 40 in 1970 to 8 in 1976. And they're hoping you go, wow, look at how much that fell because of legalization. Now, I don't know how to insert a graphic into the video, sorry, so I'm just going to have to show you the graphic that I brought up on my iPad. But I want you to look at that. Okay, that is annual abortion deaths since 1940. So you can look, even in 1940, okay, it wasn't at 5 or 10,000, wasn't anywhere near it. But we're starting to see antibiotics and blood transfusion, and you can look at how that just plummeted. And that's because women were getting fewer infections to begin with, and the infections can be treated, the hemorrhage can be treated. Now, we look in the 1950s, it leveled off. I have not yet been able to figure out why, but it started falling again pretty steeply. And if you look, here we go, that first vertical line is at 1970, when New York legalized abortion on demand. And you can see that the blue or purple, I don't know what color it looks on your screen, on the top is illegal abortion deaths. And that orange underneath is the legal ones. And as you can see, they're just rising up and taking up a larger percentage of the abortion deaths. But the abortion deaths just started falling. So, and there is one thing we also know is that we know we do not have accurate numbers anymore. And that's a whole nother video to explain why that is. So you may be thinking, well, why didn't legalization reduce abortion deaths? Well, the fact is that doctors were doing abortions before legalization. The vast, vast, vast majority of abortions before legalization were being done by doctors. They were either being done by doctors who would slip them in through some kind of health loophole, or maybe they just do a D&C claiming the woman was already having a miscarriage. So they didn't quit when it became legal. The same people who were doing it before it became legal were continuing to do it after it became legal. Now, you're not changing who's doing it, but they did change the consequences of screwing up. It used to be if you killed a woman in a botched abortion, that was murder. This was not some little, oh, well, these things happen. All surgery has risks. No, this was murder. The very first person ever sentenced to die in the electric chair in Illinois was an abortionist who killed a patient. Okay. He got his conviction overturned on appeal, but that at least tells you how seriously this was taken. It was not just no big deal, all surgery has risks. But after legalization, it wasn't murder anymore if you killed an abortion patient, unless you did something absolutely appalling. Okay. And I know of 3 criminal abortionists who had clean records before legalization, no dead patients. Each went on to get appallingly sloppy and each killed 2 patients in their safe and legal practice. So for every lay abortionist that hung up their instruments after legalization kind of drove them out of business, there was somebody else who got quacky. So legalization did nothing to change the numbers. All it did was it made women trust the abortion facilities more because they go in assuming that they're being inspected, they're kept clean, the state would close them down if there was anything wrong with them. So the women are less wary, and so are the doctors, because it takes a lot to get arrested anymore.